The morning rush at the cafe was nothing new to Maya Torres, plates balanced on one arm. Coffee refills delivered before anyone had to ask. And the same tight smile she'd worn for years. But behind her calm rhythm, the bills were piling up. Luz's school fees were overdue, and the rent clock was ticking. Then one rainy morning, a stranger in a tailored coat sat quietly in the corner booth. A forgotten wallet, a paid-for coffee, and an unspoken exchange of glances simple enough. Until 2 days later, Maya woke up to something she couldn't explain, an unexpected change that left more questions than answers. Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The morning started before the sun had properly settled into the sky. With the low hum of the refrigerator and the hiss of the espresso machine filling the air, the cafe smelled of fresh coffee beans and butter warming on the griddle, a scent that clung to every surface and every stitch of Maya Torres's uniform. She moved through the narrow aisle between tables with a kind of practiced rhythm, balancing plates on her forearm, refilling mugs without spilling a drop, and remembering every order without needing to glance at the small notepad in her apron pocket. At 26, she had been doing this long enough to make it look effortless, though nothing about her mornings ever felt easy. The corner cafe was indeed glamorous. The tiled floor had a permanent stain where someone had dropped an entire pot of coffee years ago, and the bell above the door stuck on rainy days, ringing late or not at all. But it was a reliable place, open at 6 a.m. sharp. 7 days a week, and Maya had come to know every inch of it. Every regular who walked in half asleep and grumbled their order before checking the headlines on their phones. Behind the counter, the griddle hissed under the weight of bacon and pancakes. Steam rose from the dishwasher as Clara, the other waitress on shift, set down a stack of mugs with a loud clink. The cash register drawer slammed shut, and the sound of coins rattling inside joined the layered hum of the cafe's morning song. Maya didn't rush, not in the way a new hire might, darting back and forth without direction. Her pace was steady, her movements clean. A table of construction workers got their coffee before they asked. The man in the corner booth, who always ordered toast with no butter, had his plate before his newspaper hit the table. She worked like someone who understood that small details could make the day go smoother, but for herself, still as she moved between the tables, she felt the familiar weight in her chest. Rent was due in 2 weeks. Luz's school had sent another letter about unpaid fees, reminding her in polite but firm language that they couldn't hold his spot forever if payments didn't come through. She'd read it twice before folding it neatly and sliding it under the sugar canister at home, as if hiding it might make it less urgent. Her tips from the night before barely covered groceries. She smiled anyway when she reached a table, setting down an omelet and a stack of pancakes with the same warmth she gave every customer. People didn't come here for small talk, and Maya didn't push it, but she knew that a quiet kindness could soften even the sharpest morning mood. The rush peaked at 8:15 when the line at the counter curled back toward the door. Orders came in all at once: half-calf lattes, black coffees, scrambled eggs, oat milk cappuccinos for the couple in matching running gear. Maya's feet ached, and the arch in her back complained every time she leaned over a table, but she kept moving. She had learned a long time ago that once you slowed down in the middle of a rush, it was nearly impossible to catch up again. By 9 o'clock, the line thinned, leaving behind only the regulars who lingered over refills, their laptops open, or their eyes fixed on crossword puzzles. Maya took the moment to wipe down the counter, sliding stray sugar packets into a jar and stacking saucers for the dishwasher. Now the tips jar on the counter was lighter than she'd hoped. She slipped a few bills into her apron pocket without counting. It was better not to know until the day was over. Outside, the sky had cleared enough for sunlight to push through the front windows, casting long rectangles across the tables. Maya caught her reflection in the glass as she poured another coffee, hair pulled back tight, a loose strand brushing her cheek, dark circles under her eyes that no amount of concealer could hide. She didn't look tired so much as worn in, like the cafe itself. Still, she kept moving, her quiet efficiency pulling her through the last stretch of the rush. She didn't think about how many hours until she could go home, or how much the rent would take from what little she made. She just thought about the next order, the next table, and the simple truth that she had to keep going. There wasn't room for anything else. The apartment was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator, a sound Maya barely noticed anymore. She sat at the small kitchen table, the one with a leg propped up by an old paperback novel, and emptied the contents of her apron onto the surface. Coins clinked against the wood, rolling unevenly before coming to a stop near the salt shaker. The bills were crumpled, damp in spots from spilled coffee, and smelled faintly of bacon grease. They smoothed each one out with the side of her hand, stacking them neatly into small piles. It was a ritual she performed after every shift, no matter how late she got home. The total wasn't surprising, $26 and some change from the night before, but it still brought the same dull ache in her chest. She picked up a pen from the counter and started scribbling numbers on the back of an old receipt. Rent, utilities, Luce's school fees, bus fare. She paused, tapping the pen against the table, before adding groceries to the list. The number at the bottom of the page barely moved when she accounted for the tips in front of her. She reached for her wallet, a worn leather one her mother had given her years ago, the edges frayed and soft from use. Inside, there was a single $10 bill, 3 singles, and a handful of coins that clinked when she tilted it. She sighed quietly and slipped the money from the table into one of the empty slots, flattening it as if neatness might make the total grow. Groceries would have to be bare bones again this week. Rice, beans, a bag of pasta, maybe a few vegetables if they were on sale. Milk for Louise. She could skip fresh fruit, he'd be fine with the canned peaches in the cupboard. She'd learn to make meals stretch without drawing attention to what was missing. Her gaze drifted to the old electric bill still stuck to the fridge with a magnet shaped like a coffee cup. She hadn't opened the envelope yet, but she didn't need to. The payment was due in a week, and even if she paid it on time, it would mean putting off the school fees again. The thought made her jaw tighten. Luis was 17 now, and though he never complained, she knew he noticed every corner she cut. It wasn't that she resented working. She'd been holding down jobs since she was 16, learning early how to keep herself afloat. But the constant balancing act, shifting one expense to cover another, sacrificing small comforts to make sure the essentials were met, was exhausting in a way that didn't fade after a good night's sleep. She couldn't remember the last time she'd bought something just because she wanted it. Her phone buzzed on the counter, pulling her from her thoughts. A message from Luis. "Don't forget your umbrella. It's supposed to rain," she smiled. Faintly, even with his own classes and friends, he still looked out for her in his way. She typed back a quick thanks, then glanced at the clock. She had an hour before her next shift. Maya stood and began gathering the coins into an empty jar, the one she jokingly called her someday fund. It was never full. Whenever it reached a decent amount, something always came up: a bus pass renewal, medicine for Luis when he caught a cold, or an extra school expense that couldn't wait. Still, she kept adding to it, if only to give herself the illusion of progress. She poured herself the last of the coffee from the pot, the liquid lukewarm and bitter, and drank it anyway. Then she took her wallet from the table, weighing it. In her hand. Light. Too light. She slipped it into her bag and grabbed her jacket, checking the pockets for change she might have missed. At the door she paused for a moment, looking back at the table with its small stack of coins and crumpled bills now gone. The kitchen looked the same as it always did, tidy, functional, but bare. She locked the door behind her and stepped into the hallway, already calculating in her head how to make this week's money stretch without letting Luis feel the squeeze. That was the unspoken rule she lived by. He could suspect the struggle, but he'd never carry it. That weight was hers alone. The cafe had slowed to its late morning lull. That in-between hour when the breakfast crowd had cleared and the lunch regulars hadn't yet arrived. Outside, traffic still hummed along the street. But inside, the air felt softer, the constant clatter reduced to the occasional clink of cutlery or the hiss of the espresso machine refilling its boiler. Maya was wiping down the counter when she noticed him, a man she didn't recognize, sitting alone in the corner booth by the window. He didn't look like he belonged here, not in the way the regulars did. His coat was tailored, dark charcoal wool, the kind you'd expect to see on someone stepping out of a sleek sedan rather than sliding into a cracked leather booth in a small neighborhood café. The cuffs of his shirt were just visible under the coat sleeves, crisp and perfectly pressed, and his shoes, though dusted lightly from the street, still had the sheen of something expensive. Shoulders drawn in, gaze fixed on the steam curling up from his coffee, one hand cradling the cup like he needed its warmth more than its taste. She glanced at the order slip still pinned to the counter. One small coffee, black. $3.75. That was all. No pastry. No. Side order, not even a refill. He'd been there for nearly half an hour, barely sipping. A small laptop bag sat beside him on the seat, but he hadn't opened it. He seemed to be somewhere else entirely, lost in a thought that weighed heavier than the coffee cup in his hand. When she passed by to check on the table behind him, she noticed the faint shadow under his eyes, the kind that spoke of more than just a late night. It was the look of someone who had been carrying something too long, the edges of fatigue blurring into something quieter, lonelier. She didn't intrude. Customers had their moods, and she'd learned to read the ones who wanted to be left alone. It was only when he shifted in his seat and reached into his coat pocket that the scene changed. His expression didn't falter at first, just a small, natural movement, as if to settle the bill and be on his way. But then his hand paused, searching deeper. His brow furrowed. The search became more deliberate. First one pocket, then the other, then the inner lining. The calm in his posture cracked ever so slightly. Maya pretended to be busy at the counter, stacking mugs, but her eyes kept drifting back. He leaned forward, placing the cup gently on the table, and reached for the laptop bag, unzipped it, checked a side pocket, then another. She caught the faintest exhale, almost a sigh. He sat back, his hand still inside the bag, staring at the table as if willing the missing item to appear. She had seen this before, not here exactly, but in other places she'd worked. That moment of quiet embarrassment when you realize you can't pay for something simple, something you thoughtlessly ordered minutes ago. He didn't look around for help, didn't raise his hand to get her attention. If anything, he seemed to be trying to make himself smaller, to delay the moment he'd have to admit it. Her feet moved before she'd fully decided. She walked over, keeping her tone light. "Everything okay?" He looked up quickly, almost startled, then managed a faint, polite smile. He hesitated, glanced down at the cup, then back. At her, "I think I left my wallet in my other coat." The way he said it was calm, but there was a tension in his jaw, a subtle edge that suggested this wasn't something that happened to him often. Maya didn't ask questions. She just nodded once and said, "Don't worry about it. I'll take care of it." His brow knit slightly. "No, I'll come back. It's fine," she said, already reaching for the bill on the edge of the table. "It's just coffee." For a moment, he seemed unsure whether to argue. Then he gave a small, reluctant nod, his gaze softening. "Thank you, miss." "Maya," she offered, giving him the faintest smile before heading back to the register. She paid for the coffee herself, slipping the receipt into the till, and didn't look back until she was certain her face wouldn't give away anything more than casual courtesy. When she did glance toward the booth again, he was watching her. Not in the way customers sometimes did out of habit, but with a measured look, as though filing the moment away. A second later, he turned back to his coffee, lifting it slowly, his shoulders easing just enough for her to notice. Maya could see it in the way his hand lingered in his pocket. Fingers moving with a quiet urgency that wasn't quite panic, but carried its shadow. His eyes flicked down toward the table, then toward the door, as though measuring the distance between staying and slipping away unnoticed. She had seen this kind of moment before, the small, sharp humiliation of realizing you'd left your wallet behind or miscounted your change. Most people in this situation would laugh it off, make a joke about forgetfulness, but his expression was different. It was contained, as if he was determined to keep the moment from spilling into view. She was wiping the counter when the cashier caught her eye. He had the check in hand, the smallest crease between his brows, silently asking how to proceed. Maya didn't hesitate. "Put it on my tab," she said, her voice low enough not to carry beyond the counter. She didn't make a point of it, didn't announce her intent for anyone else to hear. Just a quick, quiet instruction, the kind that would be forgotten by the end of the shift. The cashier nodded, sliding the check under the register with a practiced motion. Maya reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a few crumpled bills from last night's tips, smoothing them against her palm before passing them over. It wasn't much, but it didn't need to be. $3.75 wouldn't change her week one way or another, not compared to the bigger numbers she fought with every month. What mattered was that the moment ended for him without lingering. Too long, she returned to the coffee pots, refilling a carafe, her movements deliberate.
Nice.
She didn't want him to think she was hovering. When she finally glanced in his direction, he was watching her. His expression caught somewhere between gratitude and discomfort. He shifted in his seat, straightening a little, then said quietly, "You didn't have to do that." Maya shook, her head setting the carafe back into place. "It's fine. Really, just coffee." She offered a small smile, nothing exaggerated, and kept moving toward a table where a woman was waiting for her check. She didn't linger to accept thanks or invite conversation. She had learned a long time ago that when someone's pride was bruised, the best thing you could do was give them a way out without making them feel indebted. A few minutes later, as she wiped down another table, she heard the faint scrape of the booth seat. He was standing now, pulling his coat tighter. Around his frame, he reached for the laptop bag on the seat beside him and slung it over his shoulder. Before heading to the door, he paused, looking over at her once more. "Maya, right?" She blinked, a little surprised he'd remembered. "Yeah." His nod was slow, thoughtful. "Thank you," he said again, this time softer, like the weight of the words was meant to stay between them. She only nodded in return, already moving toward the counter with an empty plate in her hand. By the time she looked up again, the bell above the door had chimed, and he was gone, stepping out into the chill that seeped in through the open frame. Maya didn't dwell on it. Customers came and went, each carrying their own story she'd never know. Still, there was something about the way he'd looked at her, not curious exactly, not even surprised, but as if he'd recognized something he couldn't name. She brushed the thought aside and focused on stacking plates, the familiar rhythm of the café pulling her back into the steady hum of her shift. By the end of the hour, the corner booth was filled again, the memory of his presence fading into the background like so many others before him. But somewhere in the quiet of her mind, the look in his eyes lingered, faint but persistent, like a note you can't quite place but can't stop hearing. He didn't leave right away. Most people, after an awkward moment like that, would have hurried out, eager to let the door close on the embarrassment. But he stayed seated, his coat still buttoned, hands resting lightly on the table as though he wasn't sure whether to stand or wait for some invisible signal. The coffee sat in front of him, half empty now, cooling by the second. He didn't reach for it. His eyes drifted toward the window, then back to the counter where Maya was stacking plates, her movements quick but unhurried, practiced from years of service. Maya noticed him in her periphery, that stillness in the middle of a moving room. He didn't have the restless energy of someone checking the time or scrolling through a phone. Instead, there was something more measured in the way he lingered, as though he was deciding whether to say something more or let the moment pass. She was used to customers staring, some out of boredom, some out of habit, but this felt different. There was no intrusion in his gaze, no expectation, just thought. When she finally approached the counter to drop off a stack of mugs, she felt rather than saw him shift in his seat. A small movement, leaning forward slightly, his voice carrying across the short distance without being raised.
"Al, what's your
Name?" She glanced over her shoulder at him, a little caught off guard, but her expression didn't change much. Maya," she said simply, the words slipping out with the easy tone she used when introducing herself to anyone. She didn't add a last name. She didn't need to. His lips curved, not quite into a smile, but into something close, a softened acknowledgement. "Maya," he repeated quietly, almost to himself, as though testing the sound of it. He gave a short nod, his gaze steady, and then reached for his coat sleeve, brushing away an invisible speck of lint. She turned back to the mugs without asking for his. There was nothing else to add, and she sensed that if the exchange lingered too long, it might lose whatever it was that made it feel different. Sometimes it wasn't about words. Sometimes it was enough to simply be seen and to return that awareness without turning it into something larger. A minute later, he rose from the booth, sliding out with the kind of controlled grace that suggested he was used to moving in spaces where attention followed him. The laptop bag was slung over his shoulder, the strap pressed neatly against the line of his coat. He crossed the room without hurry, his shoes making muted thuds against the tiled floor. Maya was at the far end of the counter, wiping down a spill left by a hurried customer, when the bell above the door gave its soft, uneven chime. He had one hand on the frame, the other pushing the door open just enough for the cold air to spill inside, but he didn't step through right away. Instead, he glanced back. It wasn't the casual, passing look of someone checking the room out. Of habit. His eyes sought hers, and for a brief moment, they met steady, unbroken. There was no smile this time, no nod, just a quiet acknowledgement in that look, like the echo of something unfinished. Then he turned, stepped into the street, and let the door close behind him. The sound of it shutting was soft, almost lost beneath the low hum of the espresso machine, but Maya felt it anyway. She set the rag down, fingers resting on the counter. For a second longer than necessary, her mind half in the café and half on the man disappearing into the gray morning outside. She didn't know his name, didn't know if she'd see him again. But there was a thread, thin and nearly invisible, that seemed to stretch between them in that moment. Not heavy enough to pull, not tight enough to bind, just there and even. As the day moved on, as the next customer stepped inside with the smell of rain on their coat, the feeling of that glance stayed with her, tucked away like a note she hadn't yet read. By the time Maya stepped out of the cafe, the sky had settled into a flat, unbroken gray, the kind that seemed to press down over the street and make the air heavier. The drizzle was fine enough to feel like mist, but steady enough that it found its way into her hair and down the back of her neck. She pulled her jacket tighter around her, but the wind still slipped through the thin fabric, like the pocket on the right side had a hole she'd been meaning to sew for months. But there was always something more urgent but fair. Groceries, the electric bill. She'd learned to keep her keys in the left pocket, where they wouldn't vanish through the frayed lining. Her sneakers made a soft, damp sound against the sidewalk, each step sinking slightly into the grit left behind from last night's rain. The rubber on the soles was wearing thin, the edges lifting in places, but they were still holding together for now. She kept her eyes forward, head tilted just enough to avoid the wind whipping around the corners of buildings. She passed by the same row of shops she always did on her walk home, boutiques with bright window displays, shelves lined with things that caught the light in tempting ways. A gold scarf draped over a mannequin's shoulders, the soft folds of its fabric spilling down like water, a leather bag with polished brass buckles positioned under a warm spotlight, jewelry on black velvet stands, glinting even in the muted daylight. She didn't linger. Not because she didn't want to, but because she knew the pull of wanting something you couldn't have. Looking too long only made it heavier to carry. Instead, she focused on the parts of the street that cost nothing to notice. The steam curling up from a manhole cover, the way rain gathered into small rivers along the curb, carrying leaves in slow spirals, the sound of the crosswalk signal clicking faintly before turning green. She let those details fill the space in her mind where longing sometimes tried to settle. Traffic passed in slow waves, tires hissing over wet asphalt. She pulled her jacket closer, fingers brushing the edge of the hole in the pocket. She'd once thought about sewing it with mismatched thread just to get it done. But something about leaving it that way had started to feel symbolic, like a small, private marker of how she managed to keep going despite the frayed edges. Gust of wind sent the drizzle sideways, dampening the cuffs of her jeans. She didn't bother to speed up. Rushing home only meant arriving sooner to the same small apartment with its flickering kitchen light and the draft that came in through the bathroom window. The walk gave her time to shed the weight of the shift, to let the hum of the cafe fade from her mind. She passed the corner store where she sometimes picked up milk or bread when she had a few extra dollars, the glow of its neon sign reflecting on the wet pavement. The man behind the counter gave her a nod through the glass, and she returned it without stopping. 2 more blocks and she would turn onto her street, the one lined with narrow buildings and balconies where laundry sometimes hung, even in the rain. Her pace stayed steady, her breath forming faint clouds in the air. She thought about the man in the corner booth, about the way he'd looked back before leaving. It wasn't the first time she'd helped a customer without making it a big deal. But for some reason, the moment had stayed with her. She shook it off as the wind shifted again, bringing the smell of wet concrete and something faintly metallic. By the time she reached her building, her sneakers were damp, her jacket clanging cold against her shoulders. She dug her keys from her left pocket, feeling the familiar scrape of the metal against her fingertips, and let herself in without a pause. The warmth inside wasn't much, but it was enough to soften the chill in her hands. She hung her jacket by the door, the tear in the pocket catching briefly on the hook before sliding free, and set her bag down on the chair by the wall. It was another day done, another walk weathered, and tomorrow there would be another. The apartment smelled faintly of garlic and onions, the kind of simple base that could stretch a meal into something warm, even when there wasn't much to work with. Maya stirred the pot on the small stove, the wooden spoon clinking softly against the sides. Luis was already at the table, slouched in his chair with his chin propped in one hand, scrolling through something on his phone. His school bag was tossed against the wall, one strap frayed nearly through. The sound of the lock clicking had barely faded when he glanced up. "Smells good," he said, the words muffled by a yawn. "It's just rice and beans," she replied, dividing the food into 2 chipped bowls. She added a sprinkle of shredded cheese on top of his. There was only enough for 1 portion, and she didn't mind letting him have it. She carried the bowls to the table, setting them down with a soft thud. Luis grinned, picking up his fork. "Living the high life, huh?" What did you do today, big spender? Splurge on groceries again?" She rolled her eyes, a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Something like that." She didn't mention the man in the café, the coffee she'd paid for without thinking. It didn't feel important enough to bring up. And besides, she didn't want him to worry about how freely she gave away a few dollars when they had so few to spare. He dug into the food without ceremony, and for a while, the only sound in the room was the scrape of forks and the faint hum of the refrigerator. The window beside the table rattled softly whenever a gust of wind passed through the alley outside. Maya wrapped her hands around her bowl, letting the heat soak into her fingers. "Coach says we might get new uniforms next season," Luis said, between bites. "But we have to help fundraise for them. You think I could maybe—" "We'll figure it out," she interrupted gently, already knowing what he was about to ask. She didn't let him finish, because she didn't want him to feel like he had to justify wanting something so small. She could already see herself finding an extra shift or 2, maybe selling the old portable speaker she kept in the closet. He gave her a look, somewhere between skeptical and grateful, then shrugged and went back to eating. "Guess I should thank you now, before you start selling my stuff to pay for it," she laughed quietly. "Don't tempt me." They finished the meal in companionable silence, the kind that didn't need filling. Afterward, Luis carried his bowl to the sink without being asked, running the water just long enough to rinse it before leaving it there for her to wash later. He mumbled something about homework and disappeared into the bedroom they shared, closing the door behind him. Maya stayed at the table, her empty bowl in front of her, the steam now just a faint wisp curling into the cool air. She leaned back, in her chair, the wood creaking under her weight, and let her gaze drift toward the small window. The streetlight outside cast a pale yellow glow across the cracked sill, and somewhere below, a car door slammed, followed by the muffled sound of footsteps on wet pavement. Her mind wandered back to the café, to the man in the corner booth, and the way he'd lingered after she paid for his coffee. She tried to convince herself it was nothing, just a moment, just a cup of coffee, just another customer passing through. But the image of him looking back, before stepping into the cold, clung to her thoughts. She shook her head, pushing the memory aside. There was no point dwelling on it. She had bills to think about, shifts to plan, groceries to stretch. The rest was just noise. She picked up the bowls, stacked them in the sink, and ran the water until it turned warm. A steady rush filled the room, soft enough to let her thoughts scatter into the background. When the dishes were done, she turned off the light in the kitchen and headed toward the bedroom. Luis was already stretched out on his bed, headphones in, the faint sound of music leaking into the air. She didn't say anything as she climbed into her own bed, pulling the blanket up to her chin. The night settled in around them, quiet and familiar, and she let herself sink into it, knowing morning would come too soon. The morning light was thin, barely slipping past the heavy clouds outside, and the air in the apartment felt cooler than it should have. Maya sat at the small kitchen table, her hands curled around a mug of coffee that had already gone lukewarm. Luis had left early for school, leaving behind the faint smell of soap and the sound of the door clicking shut. The quiet was a relief, a small pause before the weight of the day settled in. On the table, the vibration rattling against the wood, she didn't move at first. Morning alerts were almost never good reminders about due dates. Low balance warnings from the bank, the occasional spam text pretending to be from some delivery service. She had learned that sometimes letting the phone sit was easier than facing whatever new reminder it carried. It buzzed again, this time with the distinct chime of her banking app. Her instinct was to ignore it and sip her coffee instead, but something in the back of her mind pushed her to check. Maybe it was habit, maybe the faint hope of seeing a small transfer from tips or an unexpected refund. I don't know. She reached for the phone, her thumbs sliding across the screen to unlock it. The app opened slowly, the familiar blue logo giving way to her account summary. She expected to see the usual low number staring back at her, the one she had mentally prepared for. But her eyes caught on the new line near the top of the transaction list. And for a moment, her brain didn't process what she was looking at. Deposit. $50,000, the number sat there. Black against the white screen, so still and certain it looked unreal. She blinked, then blinked again, as if her vision might be playing tricks on her. The figure didn't change. $50,000? She read it silently, the syllables heavy in her mind. Her first reaction was disbelief, so sharp it made her heart thud hard against her ribs. She checked the date today, time just after midnight, the sender blank. No name, no business, just a generic ACH credit. This had to be a mistake. People like her didn't wake up to deposits like this. She scrolled back through her history looking for some clue, some forgotten application or refund. The largest deposit she'd ever had was from 2 weeks of tips pooled together with a paycheck, and even that felt like a windfall at the time. She set the phone down on the table and stared at it like it might explain itself. A knot tightened. In her stomach, she knew better than to touch money that wasn't hers. The last thing she needed was for the bank to claw it back after she'd used it. Or worse, accuse her of something she hadn't done. Her mind jumped through possibilities. Maybe it was a clerical error. Maybe someone had sent money to the wrong account. Maybe it was some elaborate scam. She imagined calling the bank, sitting on hold for an hour, only to be told it was a glitch and that they'd reverse it. Still, her eyes kept drifting back to the number, the way it filled the space. On the screen so cleanly. $50,000. The sum was so far outside her reality that it didn't even seem like the same currency she scraped together for rent and groceries. She wrapped her hands tighter around her coffee, the warmth grounding her for a moment. A strange mix of emotions. Swirled caution, curiosity, and the faintest flicker of something she didn't want to name as hope. Her rent could be paid for over a year. Luce's school fees could vanish overnight. She could fix the heater, replace the sneaker she'd been wearing into the ground, buy fresh fruit without checking the price per pound, but she didn't move to do any of that. Instead, she locked the phone, set it face down on the table, and stared at the grain in the wood. The world outside her window carried on as though nothing had changed, cars sliding past, rain streaking the glass, the low murmur of the city, yet inside her, something had shifted. She didn't know if it was the start of something or just a strange, fleeting moment, but she felt it all the same. The number in her account was still there, waiting, silent. And she wasn't sure if it was a gift, a mistake, or the beginning of a problem she didn't yet understand. The number sat in her mind like a stone at the bottom of a pond, heavy and unmoving. Even after she'd put her phone down, Maya found herself picking it back up every few minutes, locking the screen just to make sure she hadn't imagined it. Each time, the same black digits stared back at her, calm and matter-of-fact, as if $50,000 belonged in her account, as naturally as a $10 tip or a bus fare charge. It didn't feel real. She told herself there had to be an explanation, something simple, maybe a clerical error, maybe a transfer meant for someone with a similar account number. The logical thing to do was to call the bank before she let her thoughts go anywhere else. She set her coffee aside, grabbed her phone again, and scrolled to the bank's customer service number. The hold music was thin and tinny through the speaker, the kind of repetitive melody that made seconds feel like hours. She kept glancing at the clock as if the time would speed up, her free hand tapping restlessly against the table. When the line finally clicked and a voice came through, she straightened in her chair. "This is Tanya with customer support," the woman said, her tone cheerful but detached. "How can I help you today?" Maya cleared her throat, suddenly aware of how strange this was going to sound. "Hi. There's been a large deposit into my account. I think it might be a mistake." "All right, I can look into that for you." "Can I have your account number and verify some details first?" Tanya asked. Maya rattled them off, answering each security question as quickly as she could. After a pause, keys clicking faintly on the other end, Tanya said, "Yes, I see the transaction here. $50,000, correct?" "That's right," Maya replied, pressing her palm against her forehead. "It wasn't from me. I don't know where it came from. It appears to be a verified ACH transfer," Tanya said. "No sender details were included in the transaction record, so I can't provide you with the origin beyond that." Maya frowned. "So you can't tell me who sent it?" "I'm afraid not," Tanya replied. "It's marked as cleared funds, so it's available for your use. If it's an error, the sender may initiate a reversal, but there's no request pending at this time." Maya gripped the phone a little tighter. "So, you're saying it's just there, and I can spend it, ma'am?" "But as I mentioned, if the transfer was made in error, the originating party may request the funds be returned." Tanya's voice didn't change. It was the same even tone as before, the same slight lilt at the end of each sentence. Maya said faintly. "Okay, thanks." She hung up before the woman could say anything else. The phone felt heavier in her hand now. She set it on the table, then stood, the movement abrupt. Her legs carried her across the small kitchen, then back again, her socked feet whispering against the worn linoleum. She folded her arms, then unfolded them, then rubbed at her temples. The money was real. The bank confirmed it. And yet it didn't feel safe, not in the way a paycheck did. This wasn't a slow trickle of earnings she could trust. This was a lump sum dropped into her life without warning, without reason. She pictured using it paying the rent months ahead, clearing Luce's school fees, fixing everything in the apartment that had been patched and repatched over the years. And then she pictured the bank calling her in a week, saying there'd been a mistake and they needed every cent back. Her chest felt tight as she moved to the window, watching the slow line of cars pass below. The drizzle from earlier had thickened into a steady rain, blurring the view of the opposite building. She pressed her fingers to the cool glass, willing her thoughts to slow down, but they kept circling back to the same question. Why her? The account was in her name. The bank said it was verified. But there was no sender, no note, no reason. It was the kind of thing that happened in stories, not in her life. And yet here it was, waiting for her to decide whether to touch it or pretend it wasn't there. She turned away from the window and started pacing again, her mind caught between temptation and fear. $50,000, enough to change everything, and enough to ruin her if it vanished as suddenly as it appeared. By the time Maya stepped into the café that afternoon, the familiar smell of coffee and warm bread usually brought her a sense of steadiness. Today, it barely registered. She tied her apron on with fingers that felt clumsy, her mind still tangled in the same loop it Had been since morning. Every order she took, every plate she carried, was threaded with the weight of that number sitting silently in her bank account. The lunch rush was manageable, steady enough to keep her moving, not so busy that she could lose herself in the chaos. She kept catching herself glancing at the clock, her focus splintering with each tick forward. Once, while refilling the sugar, caddies, she nearly knocked one over entirely, catching it at the last second. Clara noticed. "You're somewhere else today," Clara said, sidling up to the counter with a stack of used mugs balanced on one arm. She was the kind of coworker who noticed things even when you tried to keep them small, and she had a way of prying without making it feel like prying. Maya gave a quick shake of her head. Just didn't sleep much. It was her go-to excuse for everything from bad moods to clumsy moments. Clara raised an eyebrow. Didn't sleep much? Or can't stop thinking about something? The directness made Maya pause. She pressed her lips together, debating whether to brush it off again. But the words were heavier inside her now, too, much to carry quietly. She lowered her voice, leaning in slightly. "Something weird happened this morning." Clara's interest sharpened instantly. "Weird how? I got this?" "Deposit, Maya," said, still keeping her voice low. "Into my account. $50,000. Clara froze mid-movement, a coffee spoon still in her hand. "Wait, what? Like, from who?" "That's the thing," Maya said, glancing toward the tables too. "Make sure no one was listening. The bank says it was verified, but there's no sender listed. Couldn't tell me where it came from." Clara's mouth curved into a slow, incredulous grin. "And you're just here like making cappuccinos? Like nothing happened?" Maya exhaled through her nose. "What else am I supposed to do? I'm not touching it until I know if it's a mistake." Clara set the spoon down and tilted her head. "Okay, but did this happen before or after you bought coffee for your mystery man?" Maya blinked. "What? You know Corner Booth? Expensive coat? Eyes like he's thinking about a billion things at once? That guy." Clara's grin widened. "Maybe your coffee guy is actually a coffee-rich guy." Laugh that broke from Maya was quiet but genuine. "You're ridiculous." "I'm just saying," Clara replied, smirking. "Men like that don't forget when someone does them a favor. Maybe this is his very over-the-top way of saying thanks. $50,000 isn't a thank you. It's something else," Maya said, shaking her head. "Besides, why wouldn't he just say it was from him?" Clara shrugged, already moving toward the sink. "Maybe he's the mysterious type. Or maybe I've watched too many movies. Either way, if I were you, I'd be trying to figure out how to spend it." Maya smiled faintly, but didn't answer. The truth was, she'd thought about that more than she wanted to admit. How quickly that money could fix the most immediate problems in her life. But the unease in her chest never let her stay in that fantasy for long. It wasn't just that she didn't know where it came from. It was the feeling that taking it might come with strings she couldn't see yet. For the rest of the shift, Clara teased her in passing, suggesting she buy the café or a car, or a week-long trip to the coast, but always with a wink, like she knew Maya wouldn't actually do it. Maya played along, laughing where she could, but underneath the banter, the knot in her stomach stayed. Even the noise of the café, the clinking mugs and low murmur of conversations, couldn't drown out the thought. $50,000, sitting untouched, waiting. When the rush slowed and they leaned against the counter for a moment, Clara nudged her. "Just promise me one thing," she said. "If it turns out Coffee Guy is some kind of secret millionaire and you end up on a yacht, I get an invite." Maya shook her head, laughing softly. "Deal." But as she glanced toward the corner booth empty now, sunlight spilling across its worn leather, she couldn't shake the quiet question that had been circling since morning. If someone had given her that money on purpose, why her? And if it really was him, what did it mean that he hadn't said a word? The bell over the cafe door jingled mid-morning, a soft chime that barely cut through the clatter of dishes and the hiss of the espresso machine. Maya glanced up from behind the counter, her pen paused over an order pad. Her eyes landed on the figure stepping inside, and for a moment, the rest of the room seemed to fade into the background. It was him, the man from the corner booth. one she'd thought about more than she wanted to admit over the past 2 days. He wore the same dark coat, though today the collar was turned down. The faint dampness on the shoulders suggested he'd been outside in the drizzle. His posture was straight but not rigid, the kind of presence that drew attention without him having to seek it. His eyes swept the room briefly, and when they found hers, there was a flicker of recognition, and something else she couldn't quite name. Without a word, he made his way to the same booth he'd taken before. This time, instead of ordering just coffee, he asked for a full breakfast: eggs, toast, bacon, the works. She nodded, jotting it down, her fingers a little tighter around the pen than usual. When the plate was ready, she set it down in front of him. But he didn't pick up his fork. He just sat there, his hands resting loosely on the table, his gaze drifting toward the window as though he were looking through it, not at it. Maya lingered for a second, wondering if he'd forgotten something. Then his voice came low and even. "Could you sit for a minute?" The words caught her off guard. Customers asked for refills, for the check, for napkins, but not for her company. She hesitated, glancing toward the counter where Clara was wiping down mugs. Clara caught her eye and lifted her brows in an unspoken go-ahead, sliding into. The opposite seat felt strange, like crossing an invisible line between her role as waitress and something more personal. Up close, she could see the faint shadows under his eyes, the careful way he carried himself, as though every movement was considered. "I never properly thanked you," he said, folding his hands together. "For the coffee the other day?" Maya shook her head lightly. "You don't have to thank me. It was just a coffee." His eyes stayed on her, steady. It wasn't just a coffee. Didn't know how to respond to that, so she looked down at the table for a moment. The eggs on his plate were cooling, untouched. "You seemed unbothered," he went on, "like you weren't keeping score." "I wasn't," she said. "Simply, you didn't have your wallet? I had a tab open it. It wasn't a big deal." For the first time, there was the faintest curve at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but close.
No.
Not many people do things without expecting something back. Maya lifted her shoulders in a small shrug.
Ow.
"Guess I'm not most people." There was a pause. Outside, a bus rumbled past, sending a brief vibration through the glass. He looked at her as if he were weighing whether to say something more, but whatever it was, he kept it to himself. Steady leaned back slightly. "Do you always work here? Most days," she said. "Steady work? Keeps the bills paid." His gaze softened, but there was still that unreadable layer beneath. "I imagine that's not easy." She let out a quiet laugh. "It's a job. They're not supposed to be easy." Another silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, but charged with the sense that something was moving just under the surface. Finally he nodded toward his untouched plate. "Would you mind boxing this up for me?" She blinked. "You're not eating?" "It's not hungry," he said, almost. Absently, she gathered the plate, standing. He didn't look away as she stepped from the booth, and for some reason, that glance stayed with her long after she'd closed the takeout container and set it back down. By the time she returned from the counter, he was pulling on his coat. He thanked her again, his voice quiet but deliberate, and left without taking more than a few bites of toast on his way out. It wasn't until she was wiping down the table that she noticed the folded piece of paper tucked beneath the sugar caddy. No name, no, just an envelope with her name printed in neat, unfamiliar handwriting. Maya hesitated before sliding into the booth again, the air between them carrying the faint scent of his untouched breakfast, and the low hum of conversation from the other tables. The man's eyes followed her movements with a calm, deliberate focus, as if he'd been waiting for her to sit before he said anything. "I should probably introduce myself," he began, his voice even but carrying a certain gravity. "Daniel. Cross." The name meant nothing to her, though something about the way he said it suggested it was the kind of name people were usually supposed to recognize. He didn't offer a handshake, and she didn't expect one. There was a formality in his tone, but not in his manner. "Maya," she replied, though he clearly already knew it from the other day. She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, feeling oddly aware of every small gesture. "I own a few companies," he continued, almost as an afterthought. Like he was telling her he lived across town. Real estate, some manufacturing, a few investments. but I don't spend much time talking about it." She studied him for a moment. There was no arrogance in his tone, no performative wealth. It sounded like a list of facts he'd memorized rather than a story he wanted to tell. "Why not?" she asked. Daniel's gaze shifted briefly toward the window where the drizzle outside had turned to a fine mist. "Because what people do with their lives says less about them than why they do it. And most people don't really care about the why." It wasn't the kind of answer she'd expected. She nodded slowly, not entirely sure how to respond. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. "What you did the other day, it wasn't much to you, I know. But it reminded me of someone I used to know." There was a subtle change in his voice, still steady, but softer, as though the memory was close enough to touch. "She ran a little diner in the town where I grew up," he went on. "Didn't have much. Half the time she was barely covering her own bills, but she kept a tab for people who couldn't pay. No questions, no speeches, just a quiet note in her ledger and a plate on the counter. Most of the people she helped never paid her back. She didn't seem to mind." Maya could see it as he spoke, the kind of place where the coffee was always hot and the chairs never quite matched, where the smell of breakfast lingered all day. She wondered if this woman knew what her small kindnesses had meant to the people who passed through. "I didn't realize it at the time," Daniel said, "but those little acts, they stay with you, sometimes more than the big ones. The way she carried herself. It made people feel seen." He met her eyes again, and for a brief second, Maya felt as though he was looking past the café, past this moment, into some intersection. "Between the past and the present, you reminded me of her," he said simply. It was such an unexpected thing to hear that she found herself at a loss for words. "I just paid for a coffee," she said, almost under her breath. Daniel gave a faint smile, not unkind. That's what she would have said too. She wanted to ask more about the diner. "How about what had happened to the woman?" But there was a quiet finality in his tone that suggested he'd said what he intended to. He didn't mention the deposit in her account, didn't even hint at it, and she didn't bring it up. Some part of her wondered if he was waiting to see if she would. They sat in silence for a moment, the kind that felt both delicate and steady. Outside, a car splashed through a shallow puddle, and inside, someone at the counter laughed softly at something Clara had said. Finally, Daniel straightened, glancing at the watch on his wrist. "I should go," he said, though it sounded more like a pause than an ending. "But I wanted you to know small things matter. More than people think." Maya nodded, and when he stood, she stayed seated, watching him make his way to the door. The bell chimed again as he stepped out into the damp air, and then he was gone, leaving the booth and its lingering warmth behind. She didn't realize until she was clearing the table that she'd been holding her breath for most of the conversation. Maya lingered at the booth after Daniel left, her rag moving in slow circles over the tabletop, though it was already clean. The weight of the conversation clung to her like the damp air outside. She'd learned his name, heard a piece of his past, and yet it felt as though she'd only been given a single corner of a much larger picture. As she gathered the empty mug and the untouched breakfast container he'd left behind, her thoughts wandered inevitably to the $50,000 sitting in her account. Every time she glanced at her phone in the past 2 days, it was there, silent, unclaimed, unexplained. She could almost see the number in her mind, sharp and unreal, as if it belonged to someone else entirely. The obvious question sat heavy on her tongue. Was it him? Her instinct told her yes. The timing, the way he'd looked at her, the quiet weight behind his words, it all pointed in that direction. But something about his demeanor earlier had stopped her from asking outright. He hadn't been evasive, exactly, but there was a carefulness to him. He spoke like someone who measured not just his words, but the effect they might have. Maya knew that asking about the money would change the tone instantly. It would shift the conversation from a shared human moment to a transaction, from connection to obligation, and she didn't want that. She didn't want to see him pull back, to replace the warmth in his eyes with formality. She also didn't want to feel indebted. Gratitude was one thing she'd accepted plenty of help in her life. From neighbors watching her brother while she worked late to customers, slipping her a few extra dollars when they knew she was saving for rent. But this this was different. The scale of it made it impossible to treat lightly. If she brought it up, she feared it would put them on uneven ground, one of them looking up, the other looking down. And besides, she wasn't sure she wanted to know his reasons. If it was him, maybe he wanted her to use it without strings attached. If it wasn't him, then the mystery would only deepen, and she wasn't sure she could live with that level of uncertainty. By the time she carried the dishes back to the counter, she'd made a decision, at least for now. She wouldn't ask. She would let him keep whatever boundary he seemed to need, and she would keep whatever peace came from not pressing. Glanced at her from behind the espresso machine. "Everything okay?" Maya forced a small smile. "Yeah, just thinking about him." Clara's smirk was almost teasing, but her eyes were curious. Maya gave a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "Just about life." It was the safest answer she could offer. Through the rest of her shift, Daniel's words replayed in her mind. Not about money, but about small acts and the way they could linger. She thought of the woman he'd described, the diner owner who had kept a tab for people who couldn't pay. Maya wondered how many lives that woman had touched without ever knowing. By the time she walked home that night, the drizzle had stopped, leaving the streets slick and reflecting the glow of the streetlights. She passed the bakery with the pastries she could never justify buying, the bookstore where she sometimes paused to read the titles in the window, the pawn shop with its mismatched display of secondhand guitars and watches. When she reached her building, she paused at the door, looking down at her phone again. The number in her account was still there, unchanged, a quiet presence she carried in her pocket like a secret. She slid the phone back into her bag, pushed the door open, and decided for the moment that silence was its own kind of answer. The sound of Luce's laughter in the other room drifted through the thin walls of their apartment. Pulling Maya back from the fog of her thoughts, he was watching some old comedy. Rerun, the canned studio audience laughter mingling with his own. She stood at the kitchen counter, hands resting on the edge, and for a moment, the here and now blurred into something older, heavier. She didn't talk about the years before much, partly because people rarely asked, partly because she'd learned long ago that most didn't know what to do with the answers. The story was simple on paper. Her parents gone in an accident when she was 17, leaving her and Luis with no extended family, willing or able to step in. But the reality of it lived in sharper, quieter moments that had never really left her. The night of the accident had been cold, the kind of cold that sank into your bones and made the air smell faintly metallic. She'd been studying at the kitchen table, trying to balance homework and keeping an eye on Luis, who was sprawled on the floor drawing superheroes. The phone call had been short, the voice on the other end steady but detached, as though they were reading from a script they'd recited too many times. By the time she hung up, the heat in the apartment felt different, thinner somehow. The weeks that followed were a blur of paperwork, hushed conversations in cramped offices, and faces she barely knew trying to look sympathetic. She learned how quickly people could vanish when there was no easy way to help. A few neighbors dropped off casseroles. A teacher handed her a small envelope of cash collected by the staff. And then, just as quickly, the world seemed to decide she and Luis would manage on their own. Maya took her first night job at a grocery store, stocking shelves until 2 a.m. The scent of cardboard and cleaning solutions settling into her clothes. She'd come home just in time to wake Luis for school, her eyes stinging from the shift between fluorescent lights and the dim morning sky. On good days, she'd manage a few hours of sleep before heading to class herself. On bad days, she went without, letting coffee stand in for rest. She learned to stretch every dollar until it was paper thin. A gallon of milk had to last the week. Clothes came from donation bins or the clearance racks at thrift stores. She kept a mental list of what could be skipped: new shoes, birthday, parties, dinners, out because those things belonged to a life they didn't have anymore. What they did have was each other. She made sure Luce's lunches were packed, his homework checked, his shoes tied before he stepped out the door. She went to every school meeting, even when it meant sprinting from work. She learned to read his moods, to know when he needed space and when he needed her to sit on the couch beside him and pretend the world wasn't pressing in. Somewhere along the way, The act of giving, of stepping in without being asked, became second nature. It wasn't about grand gestures or recognition. It was about the quiet things that made survival possible. Bag of groceries without a word. The bus driver who let Louise ride free on days she couldn't spare the fare. Those small kindnesses left a mark deeper than she could explain, and they shaped the way she moved through the world. By the time she was out of school and working full-time, the habit was woven into her life. If someone came up short at the register, she'd cover it if she could. If a coworker needed a ride home, she'd wait after her shift. It wasn't charity, it was a way of repaying a debt she could never fully settle. Even if the faces of those who'd once helped her had, long since faded from memory. Luce's laughter rang out again from the other room, breaking her from the spiral of memory. She glanced at the small stack of bills on the counter and the single envelope of cash she'd tucked away from tips. It wasn't much, but it was enough. For now, and that had always been the rule, enough for now was good enough. She poured herself a glass of water. Leaning against the counter as she listened to the muted rise and fall of the TV, the past was always there. Like a faint scar under the skin, visible if you looked closely, but mostly hidden. A reminder without the need for words. It was why she'd paid for a stranger's coffee without thinking.
Ow.
Why she hadn't expected anything in return. Because once not so long ago, she'd been the one who needed someone to do the same. The breakfast rush had thinned to a gentle hum by the time Maya returned to Daniel's booth. The plate of eggs and toast sat exactly as she'd placed it. Earlier, steam long gone, the edges of the bread curling slightly. He had left quietly, without so much as the scrape of a chair catching her attention. Only the faint, lingering scent of his coffee and aftershave hinted he'd been there at all. As she reached for the plate, her eyes caught the corner of something tucked just beneath it. A plain envelope, cream-colored and unmarked, except for her name, written in dark blue ink. No last name, no flourish, just Maya, in handwriting that was neat but somehow unpracticed, as though it had been a long time since the writer had committed to paper. Her first thought was that it might be a thank you note, maybe even a tip left in a more personal way. She slipped the envelope into her apron pocket, planning to open it after her shift. Away from the prying eyes of customers and coworkers, but the curiosity pressed at her like a weight. She made it 2 steps toward the counter before stopping. Turning her back to the room, she slid a finger under the flap and tore it open. Inside was a single folded sheet of heavy paper, and behind it something stiffer. She unfolded the paper first. The note was short, just 3 sentences written in the same deliberate script as her name. Some debts can't be repaid in kind. Use this for whatever makes your days lighter. No need to find me. She read it twice, the words settling into her. Like a stone dropped into deep water, rippling out slowly. Her fingers moved to the second item in the envelope, and when she pulled it free, her breath caught. It was a cashier's check. The numbers printed in the corner seemed to burn into her vision. $10,000. The air in the cafe felt suddenly different, thicker somehow. The chatter from the counter muffled and distant. She looked around, half expecting Daniel to be standing near the door watching for her reaction. But he was gone. Just the faint draft from the door's last opening and the sound of a spoon clinking against a mug somewhere behind her. She slipped the check back into the envelope, her hands moving carefully, almost reverently. But a part of her wanted to run after him, to push the envelope back into his hands and insist it was too much. Another part wanted to ask why her, why now, why this way. But the note's last words echoed in her mind. No need to find me. It wasn't just a gift. It was a boundary. Maya tucked the envelope deeper into her apron pocket and forced herself to clear the table as though nothing unusual had happened. She carried the untouched breakfast to the kitchen, scraping the eggs into the bin, the motion mechanical. Clara glanced at her from the sink. "Everything okay?" she asked, over the hiss of running water. "Yeah," Maya said automatically, her voice even. "Just, he didn't eat." The rest of the shift passed in a haze. She served coffee, refilled creamers, and delivered plates without fully registering the faces in front of her. The envelope was a constant presence against her hip, each movement reminding her it was there. When her shift finally ended, she stepped out into the cold air. The sound of the door closing behind her sharper than usual. She reached into her pocket and held the envelope again, feeling the edges through the paper. The drizzle from earlier had returned, beating against her jacket, but she didn't notice the chill. Walking home, she thought about the way Daniel had looked at her, not with pity, not with expectation, but with a kind of quiet recognition. She thought about the words he'd chosen, about debts and lightness, about the unspoken things people carry and the ways they choose to pass them on. By the time she reached her building, she knew she wouldn't cash it right away. Not because she didn't need it, she did, desperately, but because she needed to decide what it meant to accept it, whether it was just money or something more. She climbed the narrow stairwell to her apartment, the envelope still in her hand. Inside, the warmth of the small living room felt sharper against her damp skin. She set the envelope on the table, sat down across from it, and stared at her name written in that steady, unhurried hand. The eggs had gone cold hours ago, but something about the gesture they'd concealed still burned, steady and impossible to ignore. The apartment was quiet, except for the low hum of the small space heater struggling in the corner. Its faint warmth barely reached the couch where Luis was sprawled, a math textbook open in front of him and a pencil twirling between his fingers. Maya sat at the kitchen table, the envelope in front of her, like an object she couldn't quite decide how to touch. She'd spent the whole afternoon pretending to do other things, washing dishes, folding laundry, sorting through the stack of unpaid bills on the counter, but her eyes kept drifting back to it. Luis looked up when she said his name. There was a weight in her voice he noticed immediately. He set his pencil down, leaning forward slightly. "What's wrong?" She hesitated, glancing at the envelope, then at him. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to promise not to freak out." It's not a good way to start. "A conversation," he said, half grinning, trying to break the tension. But when she didn't smile back, his expression shifted into something more cautious. "Okay, I promise." Maya took a breath and slid the envelope toward him. "Open it." He frowned, pulling it closer. When he saw the check, his eyes widened so fast she almost laughed. He looked up sharply. $10,000? Whose is this? "It's mine," she said quietly. "Or, I guess it's ours now." Lee blinked, trying to piece it together. "Where did you get this?" "You didn't." He stopped himself, shaking his head as if to clear away the thought. "Wait, is this from that guy? The one from the café?" She nodded. "Daniel. He came in again today. We talked, and when he left, he put this under his plate." Luis stared at the check like it might vanish if he looked away. "Maya, this is a lot of money. Could finally get the heater fixed." Or his gaze flicked toward the window where the wind rattled against the frame. "We could replace your car before it dies completely." "You've been holding that thing together with duct tape." She leaned back, crossing her arms. "I know, but it's not that simple. Why not? It's money. You can use it." "That's what it's for? 'Cause people don't just give you this kind of money without expecting something," she said, her voice lower now. "He didn't say it was from him. He didn't explain why. Just left a note telling me not to find him. That makes me nervous." Luis tilted his head, studying her. "You think there's a catch?" "I don't know," she admitted. "But I've spent enough of my life learning that nothing's free." "Not really." He tapped the edge of the check thoughtfully. "Maybe this is different. Just grateful. Maybe it's like those stories you hear where someone does something nice for a stranger and it comes back to them." "Those are stories, Luis," she said softly.
"Our real life usually has fine print."
For a moment they sat in silence, the heater humming faintly. Luis finally shrugged. "Even if there's fine print, you don't have to spend it all. Use some for the things we actually need. Keep the rest aside until you're sure. At least then the apartment won't feel like a freezer." She wanted to agree. She wanted to let the thought of fixing the heater or replacing her car feel like a solution instead of a risk. But something in her resisted. She'd fought too hard to keep control over their small, fragile stability to risk it on something she didn't fully understand. Luis reached over, resting his hand on hers. "You've done everything for me since Mom and Dad You don't have to be scared to take something for yourself, Maya. Maybe this is the world finally giving you a break. She met his eyes, the truth in his words hitting deeper than she wanted to admit. Maybe it was a break, or maybe it was the beginning of something they couldn't see yet. Either way, the envelope stayed on the table between them, untouched, the weight of its promise and uncertainty pressing in on them both. The next morning, the cafe was already buzzing when Maya slipped through the back door, tying her apron on as she moved toward the counter. The hiss of the espresso machine, the clink of mugs on saucers, the low hum of conversations, all of it felt strangely distant. Her mind was still on the envelope at home, sitting in the center of the kitchen table like a guest she hadn't invited but couldn't ask to leave. Clara was refilling the sugar dispensers when she caught sight of Maya. "You look like you didn't sleep," she said, not even trying to hide the knowing tone in her voice. Maya shrugged, grabbing a stack of menus. "I slept fine." "You're lying," Clara said, grinning as she followed her toward the front. "Is this about your mystery guy again?" Maya paused at a table, straightening the silverware, just to give her hand something to do. "He's not my anything," she said, keeping her voice low. "But, yeah, he came in again yesterday." Clara leaned against the counter, waiting, and he left me something. Maya hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. An envelope, with a check inside, for $10,000. Clara's eyes widened. 10,000? Ah, Maya, that's... I know. Maya interrupted quickly. "I know how much it is, but I don't know why. He gave it to me. He didn't say it was from him, just left it under his plate." Clara tilted her head, studying her. "Well, maybe you don't need to know why. Maybe you just accept it for what it is." Maya frowned. "And what exactly is it?" "A gift," Clara said simply, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Some debts aren't meant to be repaid. Maybe he just wanted to do something good for someone without turning it into a transaction. "That's not how the world works," Maya muttered, shaking her head. Clara smiled faintly. "Not usually, no. But sometimes people surprise you." Maya carried the menus to another table, her thoughts pulling in two directions. She wanted to believe Clara that this was just a good thing. No hidden strings, no expectations. But she could feel the years of caution built into her, the part of her that had learned early on not to trust things that seemed too easy. Clara followed her, lowering her voice. "You've been scraping by for years, Maya. Double shifts, skipped meals, worn-out shoes. You've been there for your brother every single day. Maybe this is the universe's way of telling you it's okay to let someone else carry the weight for a minute." Maya didn't answer right away. She kept working, refilling coffee mugs, clearing plates, nodding politely to customers. But Clara's words sat with her, pushing against the wall she'd built in her mind. When the rush slowed, they both ended up at the counter, leaning against the cool surface, their hands wrapped around mugs of coffee. "You're afraid of what it means," Clara said gently. "But maybe it doesn't mean anything except that. You were kind to the right person on the right day. That's it. No one's coming to take it back. No one's going to show up with a bill." Maya stared into her coffee, the steam blurring her reflection. "You make it sound simple, 'cause it is," Clara said, smiling. "Not everything has to be complicated. Not every kindness is a loan. Sometimes people just want to make your life easier." Maya let out a small breath, but it didn't quite feel like relief. She nodded slowly, more to end the conversation than because she agreed. Clara meant well, she always did, but Maya wasn't ready to believe in the kind of world where money like that came without a price. Still, as she went back to work, her coworker's voice lingered in her mind, soft but insistent. Some debts aren't meant to be repaid. It was a nice thought. She just wasn't sure it was hers to trust. The midday lull had just settled over the cafe when Maya noticed him through the front window. Daniel Cross, in the same tailored coat. As before, though today, he carried a slim manila folder tucked neatly under his arm. He walked with the same calm, deliberate pace, his eyes scanning the street before stepping inside. The little bell above the door chimed softly, and the few customers scattered around barely looked up, but Maya felt the shift immediately. She was wiping down a table near the counter when his gaze found hers. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, nodding toward an empty booth by the wall. Maya hesitated, glancing toward the kitchen where Clara was stacking clean plates. She gave a small shrug and a curious look, clearly hoping Maya would fill her in later. With a quiet nod, Maya followed him to the booth. Daniel slid the folder onto the table between them before removing his coat and folding it carefully over the seat beside him. "I hope you don't mind me coming by unannounced," he said, his tone polite but carrying something more deliberate beneath it. "I wanted to give you something in person." Maya glanced at the folder, its smooth cardboard catching the light. "If it's another check, it's not," he interrupted gently. "And it's not charity." That made her pause. He opened the folder and slid a stack of neatly clipped documents toward her. On top was a formal letter on heavy company stationery, the kind she'd only seen when customers left them behind with their receipts. She read the heading aloud under her breath: Community Outreach Program Manager. Daniel folded his hands on the table. "It's a new division we're building. The goal is to support small local initiatives, school lunch programs, neighborhood repairs, job placement efforts. It needs someone who understands what those communities actually need, someone who's lived it, not just studied it from behind a desk." Maya blinked at him. "You're offering me a job?" "Yes," he said. "Simply a salaried position. Full benefits. And before you ask, this isn't about paying you back. I was planning this program already. Meeting you just made it clear the kind of person I want running it." She felt her fingers tightening slightly on the papers, the neat black print swimming just a little in her vision. "Daniel, I'm a waitress. I've never managed a program. I've never even had an office job." "That's exactly why I think you can do it," he said, his voice steady. "You've been managing a life on a shoestring budget for years. You know how to stretch resources, how to prioritize, how to talk to people without making them feel small. That's more valuable than any degree I could put on a resume." She glanced at the second page of job description, responsibilities, salary. The number made her throat tighten. "I don't know what to say," she murmured. "You don't have to say anything yet," Daniel replied. "Make it home. Think about it. Call me when you're ready to talk." He slid a small business card from his pocket and placed it on top of the folder. "There's no deadline, but the sooner we start, the sooner we can actually help people."
Maya sat back, still holding the edges of the folder.
Part of her wanted to believe him, to take this as the honest opportunity he claimed it was. Another part whispered that jobs like this didn't just appear in someone's life without reason. As if reading her hesitation, Daniel gave a small, almost reassuring smile. "This isn't about obligation, Maya. I'm not asking for anything in return. I'm just giving you a chance to do something bigger than what these four walls allow." He glanced around the cafe, not unkindly, then back at her. "You don't have to decide now." He stood, pulling his coat back on, and for a moment she thought he might say more. Instead, he nodded once, left a small tip on the table, and walked out the door. Maya stayed in the booth for a long moment after he was gone, the manila folder warm under her hands. Whatever this was, gift, test, or something in between, it was no longer just about coffee or checks. It was about a door opening in front of her, one she never expected to see. Whether she stepped through it was another question entirely. Maya stood outside the glass doors of the Croswell Foundation building, the manila folder tucked under her arm, her breath visible in the crisp morning air. She had gone back and forth for 2 nights before deciding to come here, still uncertain if she was walking into an opportunity or a carefully disguised obligation. The building itself was sleek and modern, but not intimidating muted gray stone, with wide windows, a subtle brass plaque near the entrance. People in winter coats streamed in and out, carrying coffee cups and folders, chatting quietly as they passed. Inside, the air was warm and carried the faint scent of fresh coffee and printer paper. A receptionist greeted her with a professional but kind smile, asking her name before making a quick phone call. "Mr. Cross is expecting you," she said, motioning toward a set of elevators. "3rd floor, first door on the left." The elevator. Doors opened into a space far less corporate than Maya had imagined. Sunlight spilled through tall windows, and the walls were lined with bulletin boards covered in photograph skids holding backpacks. Families at community dinners, smiling volunteers in brightly colored shirts. On one wall, a large calendar was filled with handwritten notes: school supply drop-off, job training workshop, food pantry restock. Daniel met her at the doorway, his coat draped over the back of a chair, sleeves rolled up as if he had been working alongside his staff. "Glad you came," he said, his tone light, as if this were a casual meeting and not the follow-up to a life-altering offer. "I thought you might want to see what we actually do." He led her down a hallway where office doors stood open, revealing desks piled with donation forms and boxes of supplies. In one room, 2 young women were organizing stacks of winter coats by size. In another, a man in his 20s was carefully packing canned goods into bags. Daniel paused occasionally to greet people by name, asking about progress on upcoming projects. They stopped in a small conference room, where a corkboard displayed printed photos of recent events. Daniel pointed to a series showing a group of teenagers in graduation gowns. "Scholarships," he explained. "Last year, we helped cover tuition for 14 students first in their families to go to college." From there, he brought her into a storage area stacked with crates of fresh produce. "Local farmers donate to our meal drives," he said. "We make sure it goes directly to families in need, not through 3 different middlemen first." In the next room, a group of people sat at folding tables with laptops open, some taking notes, while others typed. A woman at the front was explaining how to write a professional resume. "Job training," Daniel said quietly, not wanting to disrupt. "We help people who've been out of work for years get back into the market." Maya listened, her skepticism slowly being replaced by something else. Everything she saw felt real, no staged smiles. No hollow displays meant to impress donors. The people here weren't pretending to care. They were busy, focused, and invested in the work. Daniel eventually led her to his office, which was far simpler than she expected for someone who owned multiple companies. A single desk, a bookshelf filled with binders and worn novels, and a framed photograph of a small-town diner hung on the wall. "This is why I thought of you," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "You've been on the other side of this. You know what it feels like to have just enough to survive but nothing to spare? Most people in positions like this don't." Maya glanced at the folder in her hands, the job offer still inside. For the first time since receiving it, she could picture herself here not as a token hire, but as someone who could actually contribute. "I'm still thinking," she admitted. "Good," Daniel replied. "You should. But at least now you know what you'd be stepping into." When she left the building, the air felt different, sharper against her face. Wasn't sure yet if she would say yes, but she knew something had shifted. The offer no longer felt like a mystery wrapped in suspicion. It felt like the beginning of a choice she might actually want to make. Maya sat at her small kitchen table, the manila folder spread open before her, papers neatly stacked as if organization might make the decision easier. Luis leaned against the counter, munching on a piece of toast, watching her with a mix of curiosity and encouragement. The apartment was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional drip from the leaky faucet. Been over every word of the offer more times than she could count, highlighting sections, scribbling questions in the margins, setting it aside only to pick it up again. The decision had been living in her chest all week, pressing on her every time she poured a coffee or wiped down a table. In the end, the answer didn't come from a sudden burst of inspiration, but from something far simpler a moment earlier. That morning, when one of her cafe regulars, an older man who came in for the same black coffee and plain toast every day, smiled at her and said, "See you tomorrow, Maya." That small certainty, the comfort of routine and community made her realize she didn't want to leave the cafe entirely. It was a part of her life that grounded her, where kindness wasn't a transaction and where people knew her not for what she did but for who she was. She called Daniel's office later that afternoon. He answered on the second ring, his voice calm but tinged with expectation. "So, I'll take it," she said. "But on one condition, I'm keeping my shifts at the cafe. Part-time." There was a pause on his end, then a short chuckle. "I thought you might say that. Fine, I'll make sure the schedule works." Relief washed over her, not because the decision was made, but because she'd found a way to move forward without cutting herself away from what mattered. The next few days were a whirlwind of paperwork, orientation, and being introduced to the rest of the outreach team. People greeted her warmly, and she found herself surprised at how quickly she began to feel like she belonged. Her work there was nothing like the cafe meetings about scholarship recipients. Organizing deliveries for the food pantry, talking to volunteers about upcoming projects, but the same core satisfaction was there. The knowledge that her efforts mattered to someone, somewhere. Still, she made sure her cafe shifts stayed on the calendar. 2 mornings a week, she tied her apron strings, slid the order pad into her pocket, and stepped back into the familiar rhythm of brewing coffee. Balancing trays and greeting customers by name, her coworkers teased her about working 2 lives, but she didn't mind. There was a comfort in the smell of fresh coffee grounds, in the sound of the doorbell as regulars wandered in from the cold, in knowing she could pour a refill without thinking because she already knew how they liked it. One Saturday morning, as she moved between tables with practiced ease, she caught sight of Daniel slipping into the corner booth, not dressed in his usual business attire, but in a simple sweater and worn jeans. He waved her over, not for a meeting, but just to say hello. "You really meant it," he said, gesturing to her apron. "I told you," she replied with a smile. "This is home too." As the weeks went on, the balance between the 2 worlds began to make sense. The cafe kept her connected to the small moments of everyday kindness. The regular who tipped in change because that's all he had. The young couple who split a slice of pie over long conversations. The outreach program allowed her to channel that same spirit into something broader. Helping strangers she might never meet, but whose lives were changed nonetheless. Maya realized she didn't have to choose between them, because both were part of who she was. The money had been unexpected, the job offer even more so. But in the end, it wasn't about what she had been given. It was about what she chose to give, and the spaces she chose to keep close. The coffee machine hissed behind the counter. The scent of cinnamon rolls drifted from the kitchen, and Maya knew she was exactly where she was supposed to be. It was a rainy Thursday morning, the kind that made the cafe's windows fog over, and left the air inside smelling faintly of wet pavement and freshly brewed coffee. Maya was behind the counter, her apron tied in a loose knot at her back, wiping down a stack of ceramic mugs that had just come out of the dishwasher. The cafe was steady with customers, a low hum of conversation filling the space, the clinking of spoons against saucers punctuating the rhythm. She had just handed a regular his usual order when she noticed him sitting at the far end of the counter. His shoulders hunched, a damp hoodie clinging to him from the rain outside. The young man couldn't have been more than 19 or 20, with tired eyes and a worn backpack that looked like it had seen better days. He had a few coins spread out in front of him, the kind of small change that made her instinctively understand what was happening before she even heard him speak. He glanced at the menu board, then at the coins, then back again, his lips moving silently as he did the math. It was the same quiet calculation she'd done more times than she could count in her own life. When the barista on register called for his order, he hesitated, finally asking for just a small coffee. His voice was low, almost apologetic, like ordering anything at all felt like taking up too much space. Maya stepped away from the mugs and moved closer to the counter, catching the briefest flicker of embarrassment cross his face as he slid the coins forward. She didn't think twice. "Don't worry about it," she said lightly, before the cashier could punch in the total. "It's on me." He looked up, startled. "No, she interrupted with a small smile. "Happens all the time. You just enjoy your coffee." It was the same tone she'd used months ago, standing on the other side of this very counter with Daniel Cross in the corner booth, fumbling for a wallet that wasn't there. The memory sat warm in her chest now, not because of the money that followed, but because of how effortless it had been to make that choice back then, and how effortless it still felt now. The young man tried to thank her awkwardly at first. Then, with more sincerity, when she handed him his steaming cup a few minutes later. He sat by the window, sipping slowly, watching the rain streak down the glass. She didn't hover, didn't ask his story, didn't make it a moment about her. That wasn't the point. Some kindness didn't need an explanation. It just needed to be passed along. Later, when the morning rush thinned, Maya caught a glimpse of him packing up to leave. He hesitated at the door, glancing back in her direction. With a look, she recognized the same mix of gratitude and curiosity Daniel had given her that first day. She gave him a small wave and went back to wiping down the counter. The rest of her shift unfolded in its usual rhythm, but every so often, she thought about the way his shoulders had straightened after she paid for that coffee, like the day had been made just a little easier. It reminded her that generosity didn't have to be grand to matter. It could be as small as covering a cup of coffee, as simple as making someone feel seen. When she finally untied her apron and stepped outside, the rain had slowed to a mist, the streets shining under a soft, gray sky. She pulled her jacket tighter and started the walk home, her sneakers splashing through shallow puddles. There was no windfall waiting in her bank account this time, no envelope left under a plate, no job offer hidden in a folder. But as she walked, she felt the same quiet certainty that had carried her through the past month. Some debts aren't meant to be repaid in kind. They're meant to be carried forward, reshaped, and given to the next person who needs them. And that she thought was more than enough.